Namaste. I'm Vinay Dabholkar, and on behalf of KFI Mumbai, it's a pleasure to welcome you all to this second session in the series, Discovering Life Afresh. KFI Mumbai, like other KFI centers and KFI worldwide, is dedicated to the dissemination of Jiddu Krishnamurti's teachings. This year-long series is one such platform. Jiddu Krishnamurti was a philosopher, speaker, and writer living and traveling across three continents, US, Europe, and India, speaking and holding dialogues for over 6 decades. Now, before I introduce today's speaker, I would like to welcome our next month's speaker, Mr. Siddharth Menon, who has joined us. And he'll be talking about the need for entertainment next month on March 17th. Welcome, Siddharth. Now, a few words on today's speaker. It's a pleasure to introduce Dr. Shailesh Shirali. Shailesh has been associated with KFI schools since 1980s, 4 decades now. He's a trustee of the KFI and has served as principal of Rishi Valley School. He's currently the director of Sahyadri School, a KFI school. He has also been in the field of mathematics education for many decades, and is the author of several mathematics books for students and teachers. He has particular interest in ancient Indian mathematics and in facilitating inquiry into fundamental issues among teachers and students at the school level. I have had the opportunity to listen and interact with Shailesh on multiple occasions, and it's always been an enriching experience. So welcome, Shailesh. And before I hand over to Shailesh, a couple of logistics related announcements. One is please keep audio on mute unless really you want to speak up during the Q&A. Second is Shailesh will speak for about 45-50 minutes, and then we'll open the floor for observations and questions. You are welcome to type your questions and observations in the chat window, and then we'll take them up as the time comes. So over to you, Shailesh.
Thank you very much, Vinay. And thank you, Anjali, for including me in this series. I think it's a very important series of events which are going to be taking place over this coming year and taking up issues which are extremely relevant to the current day, to the current times, and relevant to all of us. So the first talk was on relationships, and I'm going to be talking about identity, which is a potentially tricky topic to talk about because it touches on many politically sensitive issues, among other things. It also has implications at a more personal level, and I am going to be focusing more on the first kind of aspect and maybe only touching on the second kind. And I will be doing it through a presentation file. I'll be starting the presentation in a minute. And just also to draw your attention to it, I will be there are many quotes from Krishnamurti in the file, in the PDF. You will find them all identified with a green background, so I don't keep on writing J. Krishnamurti next to the quotation. So the sources of the quotations also are not displayed out there. I could share them with you later on. Okay, so with that preliminary, let me start the file presentation. So you'll notice I have titled this The Problem of Identity. The way it had been shared in the announcement was the need for identity. And it struck me later that I should have titled it actually The Problem of the Need for Identity, because that's actually what this talk is all about. Now, why do we want to talk about it? So let's look at the world as it is today. And you see all these phenomena taking place in the world. Fundamentalism, which is beginning to cover the earth in so many different areas. Nationalism, which is rising all over the place. Rising spiral of violence. Racial tensions, caste-related tensions, for example, in our own country. Intolerance levels which are growing extremely high. even a breakdown in the democratic process, and of course, war happening, breaking out in several different parts of the world. And if you look closely at all of these, at the center of all of them is one common factor, which is the demand for identity. And therefore, it forces us to look more closely at what this issue is all about. And let me start by pointing out that in the field of psychology, identity is considered to be a real thing, and also that we need it, that we need to have an identity. And so I have asked at the top, the slide says, is identity an illusion or is it a fiction? So whatever it is, we must find out the truth, because the consequences are immense. They are worldwide and threaten all of us. So what is identity? So you'll notice identity is a kind of, like in language, you would call it a noun. But actually speaking, if you look closely, it is not identity, it is the act of identification which is really important. And what is identification? It is a sense of belonging to or identification with a group based on various kinds of factors. For example, you may identify with a country, identification based on nationality, or identification based on religion. That's an extremely important category. Or based on ethnicity, based on race, based on gender. That's another very important identity question, which is at the heart of so many discussions and debates going on right now. Then identification based on sexual orientation, again something which is very much in the air in today's atmosphere. And there can be other kinds of identities or identification. It could be something based on your profession, something based on your talent, on your special expertise, or something in which you're deeply interested. So the last three categories are not things which we are going to concern ourselves with very much in this talk. It's much more the first two. You can say nationality and religion, and perhaps race, in which there are really very strongly emotional factors which are coming into play. Here are some typical views on national identity taken from some authors in the United States. Quote, a key to maintaining a democracy is establishing a national identity that unites all citizens into one in-group. This is a very important statement because it is making a very strong assertion. And I would like to ask, is this true? Is it true that to have a functioning democracy, you need to establish a national sense of identity first? It was obviously taken very seriously by the founders of the USA. For example, they said this: the founders saw that national identity could not be built on traditional religious and tribal loyalties. You know, you had immigrants coming from different parts of Europe with all kinds of different, their original loyalties were all different. So they had this idea that they had to be united through patriotism and allegiance to a set of beliefs and core values. And the phrase that they used was this, e pluribus unum, which means out of many, one. And that actually was the motto of the country for a long time. Now it is something different, but that was, now this is very important, this notion that if you want to have a functioning democracy, doesn't matter about whether it's USA or any other country, but you need to have a national identity. Now, let's look at the situation in our own country today. There's a very strong feeling that we need to create a national identity by appealing to our distant past, because that's a way of uniting us. So, for example, you have a great many movements in which we recall our golden past and all the wonderful achievements of those days, particularly, say, you go back to the Gupta Empire, you know, the times of Aryabhatta and Bhaskara and so on. And similarly, recalling what centuries of colonial rule and invasions have done to our culture and to our national psyche. So all these movements are very current in the country today and taken very seriously. And the first line is absolutely crucial. The idea that we are not going to have a functioning democracy, a successful country, unless we create that kind of a national identity. So you'll notice these kinds of statements, how often they are quoted, how we love to hear them. India gave us the method of expressing all numbers by means of 10 symbols, and that idea escaped the genius of as great a person as Archimedes. This statement was made by a great mathematician physicist called Laplace. Here's another statement made by Voltaire. 2,500 years ago, Pythagoras went to the Ganges to learn geometry. And here's one statement made by Albert Einstein. We all owe a lot to the Indians who taught us how to count, without which no worthwhile scientific discovery could have been made. You see, these statements are quite often to be seen, and we like to sort of quote them to ourselves. And we seem to want to remind ourselves that our country was a great scientific power at one point in time. After all, there was so much mathematics which came out of this country. So there's a strong need for national pride in our country. And it's a very important pointer to something that is happening in our country today. And even the child psychologists say, now this meaning of the word identity now has a slight shift in its flavor. It's now referring to the identity of the individual child. But at the same time, it also connects with this question of national identity. If I have a strong sense of identity, I do not need to seek validity and approval from others. Just note that statement. If I have a strong sense of identity, I will not have the need to seek validity and approval from others. It helps me make decisions and exercise control in the way I conduct myself. It brings me comfort in times of stress. So these are statements which I have actually taken out of various sources. And is this true? We need to ask ourselves, if my intention is to stand alone and not be constantly seeking approval and validity from others, is that the right way to proceed, that I must build a strong sense of identity? If I need to exercise control in the way I conduct myself and make decisions in a rational and self-collected, deliberate manner, is that the right, therefore, the way to proceed to build a strong sense of identity? These are crucial questions. And even if I do accept that, how am I going to create this identity? It's all very well for a child psychologist to say, I should create an identity, or the child should create an identity. How do you go about it? Is it just going to come about naturally, or the teacher, we sort of continually reinforce a certain identity through our words to the child? So this has now implications for education as well. If I have to, how do I get this identity? What or who do I identify with? So these are all, crucial ways of looking at this question. And if I have to, so I have listed out here, for example, some examples. I may identify with my religion, that is becoming an increasingly important factor today. I may identify with my nationality, with my caste, with my possessions. I've just written in quotes up there, look, I have a Lamborghini, or I have a Jaguar, or whatever. You actually find children who establish their identity, their apparent superiority over others by displaying what they have, whether it's a sought after car or some friendship with somebody famous or whatever. Or I may identify with my accomplishments. I may continually remind others of the great things that I have done, or my family name, my talent. And of course, in the case of religion, I just want to point out that there's a direct link with this whole phenomenon of fundamentalism. Fundamentalism has been described as essentially about identity. It's such an important phenomenon taking place in the world today, in our own country, in our neighboring countries. It's there everywhere and associated with every religion. And all the common factor in every one of those cases is identity. So that's why I've written out there, it's beginning to cover the earth. Also, by the way, I've just written out here, children often identify very strongly with parents and family name. They certainly identify with their parents, but they also identify with the family name. And they get extremely upset if someone were to insult the family name. Just twist the name a bit and they get absolutely furious. I see it all the time happening among the children here. So now I'm going to ask a number of questions. Okay, or before I get there, just I've titled this slide, A Reality Which is Not Real. Any method for creating an identity necessarily is artificial. After all, if you're going to set about creating an identity which is not there by some process, you're going to end up creating a reality which is not actually real, which doesn't actually exist. And what are the consequences of creating something which doesn't actually exist? In other words, creating something whose base is not quite real. But actually, we are very good at this. Let me point out some quotes from a very well-known author who has become very famous these days, Yuval Harari. Have a look at this. As I said here, we are very good at this, at creating something which does not exist. So he has invented this term called fictional reality. And quote, I have just adapted some quotes from his famous book called Sapiens. Our unique trait is the ability to create and believe fiction. All other animals use their communication system to describe reality. Think of, say, the way a dog may communicate to another dog, or a cat to another dog, or a monkey. Animals convey things which they actually see in the world. That's the rationale for their communication system. But we use ours to create new fictional realities. One such fiction, for example, has become universal: money. After a look at money, money by itself is just a piece of paper. You may have whatever denomination, it's just a piece of paper, worthless. And yet we have agreed to give it tremendous value, and therefore it acquires value. Fiction has enabled us to imagine things collectively. We weave myths such as creation stories and the nationalist myths of modern states. Note the word myths. They are myths, they are fictional stories. And yet those fictional stories have tremendous consequence in binding our societies together, especially when you talk of the nationalist myths. When you think in terms of my country, my tribe, my society, whatever it is, we somehow give that a kind of an aura. And the more the aura that we give it, the more the emotion that we invest in it, the more important it becomes to us. And these myths, look at the last line, enable us to cooperate flexibly in large numbers. And Harari points out that we are unique in this particular capacity. We are not the only species in which members cooperate. Ants also cooperate. Wild dogs cooperate when they hunt, go out on a hunt. But we are the only creatures who cooperate in this particular way. But this particular way of cooperation, unfortunately, has some side effects, which perhaps we may never have anticipated whenever we discovered this unique way of living. So these fictions, what he calls fictional realities, have immense power. We look at the consequences. They have enabled us to actually cover the earth. Look at nationality, notions such as heaven, hell, religions also. We have invented religions. The whole notion of money, the whole notion of a corporation, it's an invented reality. The whole notion of liberty, equality, fraternity, ideas behind a whole revolution has sprung up because of those ideas. Ideas of freedom. Look at what's happening, for example, in United States. They keep talking about freedom, freedom to express yourself, freedom to own guns. The word freedom has got a real potency in it. And it's a myth. It's just an invented concept. So you begin to see the immense power of words and symbols and our imagination. And it is this power actually which has enabled us to spread to every corner of the earth, because behind it lies the whole enterprise of colonialism, the whole enterprise of having whole kingdoms and empires, corporations. Today's empires are all corporations. So identity too. So it is with identity. It's also a fiction. Now this is the one point where people may differ. Is it really a fiction? But we have to understand it very closely. What actually is an identity? So here's a quote from Krishnamurti. First, we invent the symbol. See how our minds work. The image in the church or in the temple or the letters in the mosque. And in worshipping that which we have created out of our thought, we derive strength. See what is happening. The symbol is not the actuality. The actuality may never exist, but the symbol satisfies and gives us vitality by looking at it, by thinking about it, being with it. Surely that which has been created by thought must be illusion. So you'll notice that he is saying something very similar. He is using a different terminology here. When you talk of the symbol is also a fictional reality, which Harari talks about. The image in the church, the image in the temple, the letters in the mosque, all of them are symbols, and we give tremendous power to those symbols. We derive strength from those symbols. But the symbol is not the actuality. The actuality, there is nothing actually. It does not even exist. But the symbol gives us vitality because we believe in it, because we think about it. And now, what is the consequence of that? Can we have a valid, genuine way of life in which the basis itself is something unreal, basis is something fictional? So I'm going to ask 3 questions at this point, and we'll proceed question by question. First question is, how does identity form, and what gives it life and strength? Then the second question is, what are the consequences of living under such an illusion? I have called it an illusion here. I think it is fairly clear that it is an illusion, but we could talk about it further. And finally, I'm going to ask, what is our destiny? If we really take this question seriously about identity being an illusion, and yet the amount of the importance that we give to this particular notion, well, what becomes of our lives? What are we going to do with this inquiry? So let me go into these questions one by one. How does identity form, and what gives it life and strength? So, as I pointed out earlier, we talk of identity as though it is some definite concrete object, as though it is something fixed inside us. But actually, it is the act of identification which is really important. It's more that we are actually doing something. And out of that action is a real action, but we create a kind of a myth within us that there is something concrete and fixed and unchanging. So we like to think of identity as a fixed object, stable and unchanging. But this itself is an illusion. The fact that we think of it as fixed. What is real is the action that we perform, this action of identification. And you can see, for example, look at this. There's our deep need for stability, our deep need to belong. Recall these lines from this beautiful hymn, Abide With Me, which by coincidence has recently been in a bit considerable controversy. It's a very beautiful hymn. And this particular verse itself is so beautiful. Swift to its close, ebbs out life's little day. Earth's joys grow dim, its glories pass away. Change and decay in all around I see. O thou who changest not, abide with me. You see the deep plea in that last line. Living in a world in which everything seems to change, nothing seems to stay stable. Is there not something which will not change, something which endures, something which we can hold on to, which we will not lose? And you can see the source of identity in that line. So from where does this need originate? Obviously, it arises from a deep sense of insecurity, a deep feeling that why is it that I'm not able to hold on to something which will not slip out of my hands, which will not disintegrate, which will not erode away, which will not just collapse. We may not even be aware of this feeling, this as insecurity. What you do feel it as, you may feel it in the form of anxiety, you may feel it in the form of loneliness. And loneliness itself is an expression of isolation, of lack of relationship, a deep sense of being unconnected with anything, and the insecurity that that brings about. Or you may feel it in the form of restlessness. You may feel it as boredom. But all these have a common factor in them. So universally, you will find when there is that feeling, the general response is invariably the same. And you see out here how human beings have a common, deep down, a common way of responding to crises. Doesn't matter which nationality we belong to, doesn't matter which religion we belong to, doesn't matter which language we speak, but our response to this feeling of anxiety, loneliness, restlessness has always been this: identify with a group, identify with an ideology, identify with a new religion or a new cause or a new philosophy. Anything which helps you hold on to something and removes that feeling of having nothing, no mooring, nothing to hold on to. So it seems to me that what this phenomenon really points to, this phenomenon of identity, this phenomenon of identifying with something that we see in the world around us, it points to a deep sense of emptiness in us. And we try to fill that emptiness by identifying with something. Now, this is where the fiction comes in, the illusion comes in. There is emptiness, and we have a despairing feeling that by identifying with something, we can fill up that emptiness. So we pursue excitement, we pursue activity with great zeal, or we pursue entertainment, anything to take us away from ourselves, anything to take us away from that emptiness, that feeling of emptiness, which is so difficult to face. So you can have drugs, you take drugs and the excitement of all kinds of fantastic experiences that you go through when you take drugs, or the excitement of relationships, different experiences, and relationships, that itself has so much more inside that word. You experience power, you experience pleasure, anything to take you away from yourself. Or there is endless consumption, which is perhaps what consumerism is based on, the excitement of purchasing new things, the feeling of pride when you purchase something new. See, all these have a common factor. They fill you with the feeling of vitality, that something new, you're experiencing something new, and therefore you're being taken away from yourself. And of course, even war ultimately, for so many people, It's an action which takes you away from yourself. Just to give an example of this, in one of the Krishnamurti books, this person called Anderson, he quotes, sorry, not, and is that his name? Sorry, I've got his name wrong. He quotes a person who has come back from the Vietnam War, and he asks him, why did you go and join the war at all? And that person replied, well, if I had not gone, it would be every night at the bar. And look at the terrible tragedy in that statement, the complete, the groove into which you've fallen, that every night, that repetitive feeling, that feeling of isolation and loneliness, and to get away from it, the excitement and the vitality of getting into fighting and shooting and so on. But sadly, all these attempts are futile. In fact, trying to escape from oneself is one of the most difficult things to do. We can escape from almost anything, but we can't escape from ourselves because, well, it's like a shadow. You can't escape from your own shadow. But look at this. I put this in, highlighted it in blue. If the basic drive behind identification at the most profound level is that sense of inner emptiness, then shouldn't we be addressing that problem? Why are we never addressing that problem? We immediately try to address it through some totally different idea. In fact, it reminds us of that Sufi story about the lost key. You know that story about the passerby, he sees a person below a lamppost and he asks him, what, have you lost something? He says, yes, I have lost a key. And he asks him, where did you lose the key? Oh, it was there. I lost it there in that dark spot there. But I'm searching here because there is light. It's easier to look for something in the light. So it's an apocryphal story, but in a way, this also is like that. It is so easy to identify with something, and we have this illusion that by identifying, we are going to be taken away from this emptiness. And there's a certain tragedy of it. So now let me move on to the second question. So we've talked about the apparent need for identification and the sense of security or stability that it brings. But we've not examined the consequences. What happens when we identify? If there's no problem, then we can go ahead. So does this desperate desire for an identity have consequences? Are those consequences benign, or is there a grimmer side to them? You'll notice that the nature of identification is that identification is always with a fragment. It's always with a part. There's no such thing as identification with the whole. In fact, that's a meaningless thing to say, I identify with the whole. It's always something which is a smaller portion. And that's the essential nature of identification. And what happens when we identify with a part? What happens when we inwardly separate ourselves out from something else? I think out here you begin to confront a certain kind of natural law, which Krishnamurti has been at great pains to point out. That division inevitably leads to conflict. It's like a fundamental law. It's almost like the law of gravity, that when you divide, it leads to conflict. And understanding why is an extremely interesting question. You can see it happening at the smallest level down in our own little societies. The moment you divide two populations, after a little while, conflict emerges from that. To quote a line from the 10 Commandments, one cannot break a natural law, but one can break oneself against that law. And that is perhaps what is happening all over the world. You consider the human tragedies which have happened over the past few centuries, and you begin to see the tremendous sorrow of this. War, genocide, hate crimes, and there is this common factor binding all of them. Think of what happened in India and Pakistan at the time of their formation, the partition riots, the terrible tragedies which happened. Think of what happened in the Balkans in 1995, when you have in Bosnia and the massacres which happened. It's an unspeakable thing, the way in which it happened. And similarly, what happened in Rwanda in 1994. huge numbers of people massacred, all because of identity, racial identity, tribal identity, different kinds of identities. In the case of the Balkans, it was a religious identity. In the case of Rwanda, it's tribal identity. Think of what happened during World War II, the Holocaust. Again, a religious identity also translated into a racial thing, a pseudo-racial thing, an invented thing, Aryans and all that business. And then what's happening in our own country? Caste violence, caste-based rapes, lynchings, religion-based lynchings. It's really extraordinarily sad. And it seems almost beyond belief, beyond imagination, when we consider the scale, the sheer scale of suffering and violence and sorrow associated with something which is essentially a fiction. Just imagine the tragedy of it. Here's a very recent item, a news item from the Winter Olympics. What toxic nationalism can do. One particular Chinese skater, she happened to fall during her performance and earned tremendous amount of hatred because of that, because everyone saw her as letting down the nation. Look at how ridiculous it can get. And identification can happen in other ways too. For example, I may author a book and I identify with it. I may start a new movement in society and identify very strongly with it, which means that if someone criticizes it, I get angry. But we are not going to be talking about that particular aspect of identification. And just as a by the way, I can also mention that sometimes identification is defined through hatred. You hate something so much, or hate a particular group so much, that itself begins to define you. There's an interesting old world wisdom here: that which you hate, you become. But we are not going to be going into this side, so I've just interposed this slide as an in-between. So you begin to see the consequences of identity, how identity separates, causes conflict, and then that conflict spirals out into deadly violence. I'm going to next 3-4 slides are quotes from Krishnamurti. Identification is a thought process. These are very important lines, just note them. Is a thought process by which the mind safeguards and expands itself. Safeguards, and because of the identification process, it expands. You're identifying with something larger. Identification puts an end to discovery. It is another form of laziness. Identification is vicarious experience and hence utterly false. Vicarious in the sense you are experiencing something which actually is somebody else's experience, but you are imagining it to be your own experience by the act of identification. And by that same token, you're putting an end to discovery, because you are just assuming the persona of somebody else and imagining that you are discovering something. You become like static objects in the process. What do we mean by identification? You identify yourself with your country. When you do that, what happens? You immediately enclose yourself through that identification with a particular group. When you call yourself a Hindu, you have identified yourself with particular beliefs, traditions, hopes, ideas. And that very identification isolates you. So identification is separative, is a deteriorating factor in life. That is a fact. That is the truth of it, whether you like it or not. So this is an important observation. He has pointed out here, Krishnamurti has pointed out that identification is a deteriorating factor in life. Why should it be deteriorating? We have to understand this phenomenon and not simply accept it as a statement made by somebody and say we'll agree with it or not agree with it. In what way do we deteriorate if we identify? It's very important that we understand this phenomenon. of how identification separates us, how when we separate ourselves out, in a way, we are separating ourselves from the wholeness of life, and how we begin to deteriorate because our learning itself stops. We are all caught in our element of discovery stops. You know, all the things pointed out in the previous slide. This is a very important point. All human beings want security. We seek security in illusions, my nation, my God, the universal God I believe in. But you don't believe in that, and so there is conflict. That is conflict between us. Belief breeds conflict. Faith breeds conflict. These are very potent statements because we give such importance to belief, we give such importance to faith exactly as we give importance to identity. And see, these are notions which strike at the very root of our being. Identification is a refuge. It is. We identify out of our own insecurity. A refuge needs protection. And that which is protected is soon destroyed. It's a very curious statement. That which is protected is soon destroyed. Identification brings destruction upon itself, and hence the constant conflict between various identifications. So I've written out here, identification needs sustenance and reassurance. You see, that's the nature of identity. Through identification, we vicariously experience pride. That's why I quoted earlier on all those statements about the marvelous things that were happening in Indian mathematics and in Indian science 1,000 years back in the work of Aryabhatta and Bhaskara. And we love to reassure ourselves and remind ourselves about things through that. So we vicariously experience pride and vicariously live on others' experiences. I've also noted here that vicarious experience can have value, but only if the intention is to learn. It could have value, for example, when one is learning how to play a game. You watch a great player playing, and through that vicarious experience, one can learn something. But we are not talking about that right now. Similarly, identification needs this constant reassurance, and therefore this phenomenon of echo chambers in which, Twitter and Facebook, where you get immersed and caught in a group which believes everything that you do, and in which everyone is saying exactly the same thing that you do. So everyone is reinforcing everybody else's ideas and opinions, and we are sort of reassuring each other that we are right. So does this not point, as I noted earlier, to a deep inner emptiness, a fear of being nothing? And what are we going to do about that fear? Now, incidentally, it may seem as though this is some very modern problem, some 21st century problem or a 20th century problem. You'll be interested to find from some quotes from the past that it's not at all modern. You have a statement from Henry David Thoreau, a rather scary statement. The mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation. There's something very sad about that statement. The mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation. A statement from one of Krishnamurti's books. The sadness of life is this: the emptiness that we try to fill with every conceivable trick of the mind. If there is time later, I will read out the full quote from which this has been taken. It's a conversation that he's having with somebody. And then there's a famous poem of T.S. Eliot, the poet Eliot, The Hollow Men. The stuff, he uses this term, the hollow men, the stuffed men. So we have become hollow. We are stuffed. We are just coated from the outside with experiences, with ideas, with a whole lot of things all gathered, plastered from the outside. And somehow deep inside us, we seem to be like as though we have nothing inside us. And there's something very sad about this. Why is there this inner emptiness in us? And it's something which goes across all human beings, every nation, every religion. What are we going to do about that? We have become second-hand human beings, quoting and following others. Psychologists, philosophers, gurus and saints have told us what to do and think. We never wipe the slate clean so that our brains are fresh. We never read the story of ourselves. The story of ourselves is the story of the rest of mankind. We never read that book. You cannot possibly learn sitting at the feet of another, nor can you follow another. But you have to observe the extraordinary content of consciousness, what man is, why he behaves in this unreasonable way without a sense of beauty, love, or compassion. The first statement may sound very harsh. It is very hurtful to be told that I am a second-hand human being. And I may react by saying, what do you mean? How can you say I am second-hand? In what way am I second-hand? I see things, I speak, I have my own opinions, my own ideas. How can you call me second-hand? I think this is a matter of looking at ourselves very, very carefully and seeing how the opinions that we pick up, the things that we repeat, how everything can be traced to what we read, whether it's through books, from authors, from the internet, from Google. In fact, there's an interesting discovery which was made by some psychologists the other day, that when you read something on Google, within a short while, it has a mysterious way of transmuting inside your consciousness, and you begin to feel that it is your own discovery. It is something that you have known forever. It becomes like part of your being. And I think it points to a certain phenomenon that happens in us. How things sink into us and we assume that they are part of us. And if we actually look, if we are really ruthlessly honest and look within us, we find that it's not our own. It's something which we have picked up from the environment. And that's why Krishnamurti has made this rather harsh sounding statement that we have become second-hand human beings, quoting and following others. So let me move on. So given all this state of affairs in front of us, this emptiness that is within us, this desperate need for security, this desperate need to escape loneliness and restlessness, and this search for identity. When we realize all this, we begin to ask, what are we going to do? What is our destiny? Do we want to continue on this path? Is there some other way forward? What do we want to do with our lives? We as human beings are the rest of the world, and the world is us. And so our responsibility is global, not just for my family, for one's children. Those are important, but we are responsible for the whole of mankind because we are mankind. But our beliefs, our ideals, our cultures, experiences divide each one of us. We are Catholic or Protestant, Buddhists, Hindus, Muslims, or following the latest guru. This is what is breaking us up, our nationalities, our insular attitudes. And this attitude brings about fragmentation in our lives. And where there is fragmentation, there must be conflict between various fragments of which you are made up. So against the backdrop of such a statement, we have to ask ourselves, what do we want to do with our lives? From ancient times, perhaps, human beings have asked if there is something more to life than just living. Something beyond problem solving, something which endures, something which lasts. And probably we have come to this following our awareness of death. And why? Let me explain what I mean by this. Something more to life than just living. Well, that statement of Thoreau's comes in here. The mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation. All we do is just going day after day, solving our daily small local problems, earning money, just meeting problems on a daily basis. Problem solving has become the substance of our life. And our brains, in fact, are problem solving instruments. And we ask, is there something which endures? Probably we must have asked this question from very, very ancient times, because the evidence has come from archaeological discoveries that human beings were interested in the phenomenon of death. They have been interested probably for the past 50,000 years or more, because graves have been found in not only in Homo sapiens, but even among our cousins, the Neanderthals, that they were fascinated by the phenomenon of death. How come we die? What happens to all the things that we think of? We have this idea of ourselves, our tribe, our this, our that, and then we die. What happens to all that? Where does it all go? And so you have these, people who have been buried with all things that they can take into another life. Their weapons, some food, some clothing, and all kinds of things. 50,000 years back, you find evidence of this, which means that this question has been with us for an enormously long time. And what Harari calls fictional reality, perhaps it was invented that long back in our past. And that's why Krishnamurti so often says in his talks that our brains are very, very old. So this habit of creating fictions perhaps has been with us for tens of thousands of years. It's not some recent phenomenon. Probably that is how religions began, the longing and search for a narrative in which the whole life had a certain meaning. If you put away all the problems that you have, there's a certain meaning and wholeness to life. Probably that's the origin of the ancient religions. But unfortunately, religion has lost all its meaning today. It has become an empty shell. And industrialization and globalization are completely indifferent to the fate of individuals. That's the modern phenomenon of it, especially in the past 200-300 years. Industrialization has just one aim. Once you have corporations and capitalism, the only thing that matters is the profit motive. Nothing else seems to have any value. And so that has become the reality of the world today. So though the origin of this question is very, very ancient in our past, in modern times it has taken a new and even worse form in some ways. So you can see now that why that statement is so relevant even today. The mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation. And I think there is a terrible sorrow in this. It's not just the sorrow of what all the killings that have happened in the wars and whether it's the partition riots or so many devastations which have taken place, but the sorrow that we have been looking for a solution to something in a completely wrong direction. We try to fill that a certain emptiness in us through fiction. And as Krishnamurti points out here, we always deal with a crisis. We never ask what has brought about the crisis. And I'm reminded often of this assembly song, it's such an important song in our own schools here. Mat kartu abhiman re bande. There's a very beautiful last line here, the last para. Tere paas mein hire moti, mere man mandir mein jyoti. Kaun hua dhanwan re bande. What is that mere mandir mein jyoti? What is that inner light? Where does one look for this light? Where does one look for that inward richness? And in the absence of that jyoti, in the absence of that richness, we are caught in this desperate search for identity, this desperate search for meaning. Where does one begin? One child once asked Krishnamurti, I think it may have happened in Rishi Valley or Rajghat back in the 1950s, why do we want to be famous? And here's what he responded. If you are known all over the world, you feel very important. It gives you a sense of immortality. You want to be famous. You want to be known and talked about in the world because inside yourself you are nobody. Inwardly, there is no richness. There is nothing there at all. Therefore, you want to be known in the world outside. But if you are inwardly rich, then it does not matter to you whether you are known or unknown. To be inwardly rich is much more arduous than to be outwardly rich and famous. It needs much more care, much closer attention. If you have a little talent and know how to exploit it, you become famous. But inward richness does not come about in that way. To be inwardly rich, the mind has to understand and put away the things that are not important, like wanting to be famous. Inward richness implies standing alone. To not belong, to stand alone. So these are words, phrases which Krishnamurti has often used. What does that mean? And what is the significance of that for the question we are asking about identity? Can one live without identification when so many people seem to consider it so important? So I've written out here, in contrast with the aggressive, self-righteous demand for identity, you have the unspoken anonymity of nature. Look at the bird feeding its young, completely occupied with living. It's not interested in being seen, being known, nothing. You have the flower growing in the ditch on the side of the road, unnoticed by passers-by, not asking to be noticed. You have the butterfly flitting from flower to flower, not asking to be seen. Can we find, instead of this aggressive demand for identity, something which Krishnamurti called the confidence of innocence? Can't there be a basis to living which is not belief, not identification, not the building of psychological walls, not the endless quest for becoming? Can't there be the beauty and simplicity of anonymity? Can't there be the confidence of innocence? What does Krishnamurti mean by the confidence of innocence? We use the word confidence usually with self-confidence. The idea of, I have a certain talent, I have a certain ability, and from that I derive confidence. But can there be a confidence in which there's a confidence of not becoming at all, confidence of being, of innocence? There's no perhaps better word to describe it. Perhaps we have never glimpsed for ourselves the strength of such a confidence. It's like the strength of a blade of grass which comes out through the road. A strength associated with complete vulnerability. So I'm coming close to the end of my presentation. I hope I have not gone over time. Here's a quote from Hermann Hesse. He's writing about trees, which are perhaps the most beautiful form of creation. A tree says, my strength is trust. I know nothing about my fathers. I know nothing about the 1,000 children that every year spring out of me. I live out the secret of my seed to the very end, and I care for nothing else. I trust that my labor is holy. Out of this trust, I live. Can we turn our backs to the unreal? I've shown out here on this slide a very famous piece, which is usually translated differently. We chant it in our schools, Asato ma Satgamaya. And the first line translates usually as, from untruth, lead me to the truth, and so on for the other lines. But that first line can also be translated as, from the unreal, lead me to the real. Can we really take this seriously? Because we have been trying to live a life of the unreal when we try to assume an identity. It is something essentially deeply unreal. And can we turn our backs to that? Thought is the mischief maker. All the images it has created in the churches, in the temples, in the mosques are not truth, are not actual. They have been invented by us and by the priests out of our fear, out of our anxiety and uncertainty of the future. We have created a symbol and we are caught in it. So first realize that thought will always create the things which give satisfaction psychologically, which give comfort. The reassuring image is a great comfort. It may be a total illusion, and it is, but it gives comfort, and therefore we will never look beyond the illusion. That's why I quoted that piece in the previous slide. Can we turn our backs to the unreal, to illusion? Krishnamurti also uses this phrase, can you be a light to yourself? Can we bring that feeling into our lives and into the world around us? When you are a light to yourself, you are a light to the world, because the world is you and you are the world. All this is implied when we are talking about turning our backs to illusion and looking for inward richness, finding out what makes for inward richness, what makes for that thing which you may call Jyoti. What is this light? This light which may come from original experience of the world and a denial of everything that is secondhand. So we have to understand the implications of this. So let me just show you my last slide and then close. The tree is nothing to itself. It exists. And in its very existence, it is the most beautiful thing. You see, a lily or a rose never pretends, and its beauty is that it is what it is. So perhaps this little quote will tell us something about the way forward. So let me close this presentation now, and we can then take the, why is this not stopping?
Yeah, that was a wonderful presentation, Shailesh. The floor is now open, everyone, and please feel free to either unmute and ask a question, observation, or type in the chat. Yeah, thank you.
I'd like to just say that there are many aspects of identity which I have not focused on very much here. I have focused more on aspects of identification in which we try to identify with something larger than us. We see something larger and we try to identify with it. And well, the whole explanation was there in that. So there are certain other aspects which I have not gone into. Maybe it will come out during the conversation.
Shailesh, it's very, very complex subject, and you have really touched upon it in a very comprehensible manner. There are many questions actually, which are emerging, and those are maybe like a self-dialogue. The aspect of identity is there when we open our eyes in the morning. Without this basic ability to identify, it will be very difficult for us to live the life. but we are talking about a different kind of identification. We are talking about having some ideals, having some imagination about the future, becoming some things. So
Yes.
how does I being part of education, I feel that education is also, by and large, I'm talking about, there are so many people doing good work in education also, but by and large institutions try to strengthen this entire aspect of identification in the student's mind. Even parents, and they are pressurizing students to have some ideals, become somebody. You have to reach to a certain image and fit yourself within that um, entire picture, as if it's a empty picture and you put yourself in that picture. So it's such a strong force which I am encountered with.
Yes.
So no, these are the thoughts which are emerging in my mind currently. I
Yes.
don't see that everyone is trying to, whoever is realizing the importance of this entire process, we are trying to do whatever we can.
Yes, you are pointing to another aspect of identity. I focused more on the aspect of identity which is leading to immense conflict in the world today. But
Yeah,
there is also the aspect which you have pointed out where uh, there is you are urged to be like somebody else. You have a role model and you're asked to be like the role model. The role model has certain ways of functioning. That's why he or she has become a very successful person in life. And so you have to be like that person. I think this way of thinking, it comes out of our own inner anxiety, our fear of failure. And in a deep way, we deny the possibility of being firsthand to the child. So the child is being coached and educated to become second-hand right from the very beginning. They may well become successful. It's quite possible. They may also become CEOs or whatever it is, but they will never shed that second-hand nature of their own lives. And I think there is a deep tragedy in this, that we give so much importance to being like some other person, to defining role models, and not actually finding out the truth of things ourselves, to be able to look at something and see for ourselves what is true and what is false, instead of being told everything through our education system, through parents or whatever. So there are many hidden issues in this phenomenon that you have pointed out, which is our own fears of failing, our own desire to conform to social traditions, social values. So all that is implicit in that, and I think it's a denial of our own ability to live, which is why Krishnamurti makes this very strong statement that we have become second-hand human beings. So second-hand is a phrase which covers both aspects of this whole question of identity, whether it is identifying with some nation or religion or identifying with a role model. Both ways that same phenomenon is operating. And what happens when we become like that? We have to, as educators, we need to understand what it is doing to our minds when we are constantly being second-hand.
yes, true.
We are denying what we are able to see with our own eyes. It's quite common, for example, in schools, there are children who, when they see something and they read something in a book which contradicts what they see, they will believe the book. They will say what I'm seeing must be wrong. The book must be right. that feeling has sort of, we have made this, the nature of our education system, it's so strong, this second-hand learning. And then all the traditions that we pick up, the ideas of religion, the ideas of nationality, and then we start feeling great emotion out of it, pride, anger, all kinds of judgments we think of, and it's all just learned, like we've just picked it up from the environment. So second-handedness has become part of our nature itself. So as educators, we would have to ask the question, what do we have to do if we are to deny second-hand ways of living? We can't just use a word like first-hand because we may not even know what it is. We have to turn our backs to what is second-hand without knowing what is first-hand. And just out of experimentation, and we may have to just, explore an unknown field.
Yeah, anyone, any students who are attending, any questions, comments?
So may I ask a question?
Yeah, Arya, please.
Yes, thank you, sir. Sir, actually, thank you for the beautiful session. I really enjoyed it. My question is, what about things like perfection? Because we all pursue perfection and want to make it a part of our identity. So do you think it is wrong? Because in a way, if we are going ahead for perfection, maybe we achieve good enough. If not being perfect, we at least achieve something good in our life. So is it wrong to make it an identity for ourselves? Like to try to become a perfect human being in one particular field, if not all?
Well, we have to go into the intention behind it. Why do we have this thought at all? When you really love something, you will naturally want to do it beautifully. If you love a particular craft, or you love a particular kind of field of activity, and you really love it, you're not in it in order to just make a name for yourself. If I really love something, I naturally will want to do something with beauty. Now, the word perfect, you have to be careful what you mean by word. Is there an ideal of perfection from somebody else's, the way somebody else has been doing it, and you already have a measure of it? Sorry. Or you really are completely into it, and you're learning. As you're trying it out, you discover the flaws of a particular way of operating. You are exploring. You're constantly learning, and you naturally want to do something beautifully. I think that's it's an innate part of ourselves to want to do something beautifully. And when we are actually doing something with our own hands, it comes about very naturally. But if we try to do it as a matter of copying somebody, that somebody is already very accomplished and I want to reach that same level of accomplishment, I think that we start going down the wrong path. Because what is the intention of it? Is the intention to become famous? Is the intention to make a name for ourselves? To me, the basic issue behind this question would be, do I really love something? And can I find something which I deeply find beautiful, which I deeply want to do something, and not out of a desire to make a name for myself, not out of a desire to become somebody. Because when I have that feeling, I will naturally bring beauty into what I do. And I think it is our work as educators to bring about that feeling in children. It's a very great challenge to do it. Anyone who has actually taught children will know what a difficult thing it is. But unless we ask that question, we will be caught in asking the wrong questions. And it will become like that Sufi story all over again. So I don't see anything wrong with wanting to do something beautifully, but we have to understand the basis for it.
Thank you, sir.
Good evening, sir.
Yeah, Neha. Yeah, okay.
Yes, sir.
Please.
Sir, I really liked the part where you said that more or less all of us, like a lot of us would be second-hand individuals, maybe because we all have role models, or maybe in some things that we want to do, we usually try to imitate a person who, as per us, would be best in that particular field. Also, when I look at the title of this webinar, there's this one question that is constantly going on in my head, which is how do we find our own identity? For example, I am a teacher by profession, and if I want to help my student to find his or her identity, even before going, how do I identify my own self? And as you said, that it's not possible for me to know myself 100%. But how is there any exercise or is there any way by which I can identify my own self?
I'm not sure you can, there's an answer to that question in the way you have phrased it. Because I think the most important thing in life is not the most, one of the very important things in life is to be able to see things with clarity, to have a mind, to have eyes that can discern things in front of us, that can see very clearly, to be able to listen to people, to be able to look at things as they actually are, to not live with false ideas. In fact, not live with ideas about people, ideas about nations. So can one live truly? Can one actually be true to life? Can one respond to life as it actually is? Then we will, you see, we will then grow in the right way. It's like this, that quote I showed you from Hermann Hesse, where you have a seed which grows into a tree. You have or that last quote that I showed. Can we simply be what, as per our actual observation of the world, can that itself live through us? We see the world, we listen accurately, and that itself brings out its own action in us. We respond to the world. We love a particular kind of activity. We give that love to the world. Why do we want an identity other than this? What do we mean by identity? When we really are deeply involved with something, that itself is life then. The moment you define yourself, I know that this is a difficult point, because in today's world, there's a very strong force which says we must define ourselves. I think we need to challenge that notion. Why do we need to define ourselves? Because of this need, and therefore you say, I belong to this nation, that's who I am. I belong to this religion, that's who I am. Or I identify with some, whatever, as I said at the beginning, some sexual orientation. There's so many ways in which I can say, I am this. But why do I need to make that statement in life? shouldn't we ask that question, that what is the basis for making such a demand, and is it really necessary? It's a difficult question, I know.
Shailesh,
Yes,
so
Vinay.
there's a related, question which is in the chat from Nikita, who is asked, in life, if we shouldn't be living to be something, then what should we be living for? Isn't trying to become a better version of yourself considered as a path to realizing your identity? I mean, echoing similar to what
Okay.
you were saying. Mhm.
If we shouldn't be living to be something, then what should we be living for?
Yeah, I mean, you take away all my, you take away my identity with being Indian, you take away my identity as a teacher, whatever, then, I mean, what am I left with? What is life? That's the kind of question I see.
I need to ask what is behind that question?
Okay, so Nikita, maybe we can chat with Nikita.
No,
Nikita, are you there?
Sorry, no. I think we both spoke at the same time. Sorry, finish what you're saying, Vinay.
No, I'm just saying, you want to ask her, more about the question, we can check with Nikita herself.
No, the question is quite clear.
Okay, I see.
Because I think this is a very strong feeling in life that one needs to have an identity. And I am saying that that notion needs to be challenged, because when you really love, when you deeply care about something, do you have to say that you are something, you are somebody? Do you have to say that I have to become a better version by tomorrow as compared to today? Or when you really love something, you do it. You're deeply, there is a feeling of deep wanting to do something, and you do it. The moment you give this continuity and say that tomorrow I must be a better version than I am today, I think that we have to examine the consequences of that idea. What happens when you fix yourself in that particular way? Because when she asks, what should we be living for? I would say, can we be living for the truth? Krishnamurti once made this statement. He said, can you be followers of the truth? Is it possible to, be in love with the truth? Which means we are actually living in contact with life. That's, if you say, what are we living for? That would perhaps be, can you live that way? Be actually in contact with what is true, what is actually happening around us, so that we are responding accurately without bias, without prejudice. If you want to do something deeply, of course we should do it. There's no two ways of saying that. Let's go ahead and do it. But living truly, living a life of truth, I think is an extremely important part of our education, of our lived lives. And we need to go into that much more deeply than we've been doing. Perhaps, I mean, Vinay, why don't you share your perspective on this?
Yeah, no, Shailesh, actually, Kalpana has been wanting to ask a question for a while. So let's give her a try. Kalpana, sorry,
Yeah.
You've been, I guess,
one more message which has come in the chat.
Yeah, so let's first take Kalpana and then we'll go to that. Yeah.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for such a insightful session, sir. I am a teacher educator, so we teach teacher trainings, and we have one of our unit on Krishnamurti, and especially this topic about nationalism. So every year we have these kind of discussion with our students with regards to it, and we always say, look at the root where we start. we start by telling the child, write an essay about myself. I am so and so. I belong, my country. So it is never where a child has got that kind of we condition them to get structured right from start. When I was doing philosophy, I had that existentialism concept of jelly like situation, or where we talked about neti neti, neither this nor that. So when we are describing something which is not this, not that, or an existentialism. So sir, you have really taken I think such a, I do not know, such a complicated concept. You brought it so simple, you made it clear. And still there are so many questions that are coming to our mind, like what the earlier participants have asked the question, what is this identity name? What is this emptiness? Will it free myself if I am away from these identities? But my major question as a teacher, educator, and from a field of teaching is, how do I bring up the next generation to have this kind of, at least not to have a fixed identity? Maybe I do not know at what age can we tell them, think beyond, go beyond what I'm teaching you. You're not just Indian, you're not just say Bangladeshi, you're not just, we are looking at the controversy of hijab row going on right now. So, you know, even a symbolism becomes your identity, a symbol. So when we are holding and it becomes an international issue, telling my 5-year-old or a 10-year-old student, or training my teachers to bring about this creativity, at least allow them to have this free flow of idea. It's not easy. It's not,
Yeah, so if there is no one way of proceeding in education, the only one thing you can definitely say is, can we turn our backs on this second-hand business, all the time filling our children's minds with, you should be this, you should be, you belong to this, you belong to that, you know, all these things which are being pressed onto our minds from society, from people. I think we have to at least give more importance to first-hand experience, which is why contact with nature, actually listening to people and understanding what people are saying. Listening itself is such an important part of life. But today, in today's world, there is mostly shouting, there's not listening. So actually learning how to listen, learning how to see things as they are, that itself contributes to your inner development, to your inner growth. Not, you know, instead of listening in the sense, not accepting, but listening to understand, listening to understand what's happening in the world, listening to understand the suffering of people, the anguish of people. You know, this or the loneliness that is around us. So there's one question here in the chat box. I'll just read it out. Knowing the truth regarding one's identity and existence in the world, why be pessimistic? Enjoy the material world with the acceptance of truth and impermanency. Well, there's no pessimism involved. We have to be truthful. We have to see what is so truth, what is actually so, and live with that truth. Can we be true? And when let's not forget that this religious question is a very ancient one in human beings, and we have to understand that feeling. It's a question which has been with human beings for 50,000 years cannot be lightly put away. It's something obviously very deep in us, and we need to go into the depth of that and see where it leads us. This question of being true to what we see, true to what we listen to hear, to find out the truth of things around us. So I would not use the word pessimism, because there is no pessimism. We are looking at things as they actually are and seeing how we can live with truth. And it's a hard path It's like walking on a razor's edge. It's very difficult, but we have to at least try it rather than take some easy way out, which is false. So that's, to me, a very basic question.
Yeah, Anjali?
Hi, sir. Sir, I have a question that I personally feel that while the acknowledgement of having a second-hand life is real, and while I completely echo with all the ideas which you shared, and thanks a lot actually for giving it a structure actually, but I also feel that, in this world, to be living, as you rightly said, a first hand life, although that's very difficult to understand in itself, is a privilege in itself. Like having an explorer or a discoverer attitude generally might also be considered or labeled as a rebel attitude by society or family. So, how do you overcome that? How do you actually try to be exploratory while not, having to fight a lot of useless battles?
Well, when one is very young, obviously one has to go along with the structures around us as long as we are dependent on people. We have, obviously, one has to do things with sensitivity and care and not go like a bull into a china shop, so to speak. We have to do things with a certain grace and sensitivity. And but if we have to see also, understand for ourselves what is the most important thing. If living with truth is the most important thing, then we will find a way of doing it with with a quality of grace and quietness. We will see that merely following a false path in the name of what is convenient is not the right thing. In fact, that has perhaps become one of the big problems in our lives, that we often take the path of greatest convenience, and that leads us, once you start going down that path, you can't then come back. It becomes a one-way path. So yes, we may be labeled as rebels, we may be labeled in various ways, but it's a great art, I think, to be able to live a life of where you follow your own, what you actually see for yourself, not just some fanciful, imaginative thing, but when you actually see something, to take that seriously and to go down that path. I think that's one thing which we have to bring about in our schools, to be able to see things truly and not just accept things because some expert has said them, some authority. That's also part of our education. So we run the risk of being labeled as whatever, rebels or whatever else we may be labeled as. But we have to do it, I think, with grace and not with a self-righteous attitude or a superior attitude, or it's up to us.
Okay, Shailesh and Anjali, we have past our time. So is this?
Yeah, I think
it's a good time to stop.
Just in case there are any questions, we can take.
Okay.
Otherwise, we can stop. Yes.
Yeah, I think okay. So just there's some message in the chat. Okay, great. Yeah. So I think it was a wonderful session, Shailesh. It was really wonderful that it's everybody sort of agreed that it's a very, very deep topic, and you really covered it very, very nicely with wonderful examples from various disciplines. So thank you so much, and thanks everybody for participating and asking these questions. Anjali, I think they can also continue this dialogue if they can ask questions on email that you have sent as well, as a reply to that. So that's a
Yes.
possibility. If you have some question which perhaps you didn't get a chance to ask, just send it as a reply to the email that Anjali has sent, and perhaps a dialogue can continue on that. Yeah. And so thank you, everybody. And we look forward to seeing you next month, where Siddharth is going to talk about the need for entertainment. Yeah. So thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.